The Haunting of Highway 66. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues of orange and red. A lone highway stretched endlessly through the desolate plains, the sign reading Highway 66 creaking in the evening wind. It was a road rarely traveled, infamous for its eerie reputation. Truckers whispered stories about a phantom vehicle that roamed these parts. A massive, rusting 18-wheeler with headlights that pierced through the darkest nights. They called it the Haunted Hauler. Jack Harper, a seasoned trucker with nerves of steel, was on a tight deadline. He had heard the stories, of course. Everyone in his line of work had. But Jack was a skeptic, dismissing the tales as drunken exaggerations or campfire lore. Tonight, he was determined to make his delivery on time, no matter what. The clock on his dashboard blinked 8:45 p.m. as Jack maneuvered his own rig down the highway. The hum of the engine was a comforting monotony, the only sound in the barren expanse. The CB radio crackled occasionally with static, but there were no voices, no other trucks. It was just Jack, the open road, and the rising chill in the air. The first sign of trouble was subtle, a distant rumble, faint but growing steadily louder. Jack glanced in his side mirror, frowning. He could see nothing but darkness. Yet the sound grew closer, a low, guttural growl that seemed to resonate through his entire truck. Then he saw it. Out of the inky blackness, two piercing headlights emerged. They were unnaturally bright, illuminating the road in an eerie, pale glow. The vehicle behind him was massive, its silhouette a monstrous shape that defied clear definition. Rust and grime coated its body, and its grille looked like a snarling mouth. Jack felt a shiver run down his spine. The stories came flooding back, unbidden. "No way," he muttered, shaking his head. "It's just another truck." But as the mysterious truck drew closer, Jack's unease deepened. Its headlights flickered, almost as if they were alive, pulsating like a heartbeat. The growling engine was deafening now, and Jack swore he could hear whispers. Indistinct voices carried on the wind. "You're imagining things," he told himself, gripping the steering wheel tightly. But when he glanced at the mirror again, the truck was gone. The road behind him was empty. Jack's relief was short-lived. Minutes later, the rumble returned, this time accompanied by the blaring of an air horn. He jerked his head around to see the phantom truck barreling toward him, its massive frame impossibly close. "What the hell?" Jack yelled, slamming his foot on the gas. His own rig roared as it picked up speed, but the haunted hauler matched him, inch for inch. It was almost as if it were toying with him, staying just far enough back to keep him on edge. Suddenly, the CB radio crackled to life. A voice, distorted and guttural, whispered, "You can't outrun us, Jack." Jack's blood turned to ice. "Who is this?" he demanded. But the radio went dead. The truck behind him blared its horn again, and Jack swerved, narrowly avoiding a collision. The highway seemed endless, stretching on into oblivion. Every time Jack thought he'd lost the phantom truck, it reappeared, closer and more menacing. He tried everything, speeding up, slowing down, even pulling over. But the truck was relentless, a predator stalking its prey. Desperation drove Jack to an abandoned rest stop on the side of the highway. The building was dilapidated, its windows broken and walls covered in graffiti. Jack jumped out of his rig, flashlight in hand, scanning the area for any signs of life. The phantom truck was nowhere to be seen. The air was deathly still, the only sound the crunch of gravel under Jack's boots. He stepped inside the rest stop, the smell of mildew and decay assaulting his senses. Faded posters on the walls advertised long-defunct attractions, and a rusty vending machine stood in the corner, its glass shattered. "Hello?" Jack called out, his voice echoing. There was no answer. But as he turned to leave, he noticed something on the wall. A series of photos pinned to a corkboard. Each photo showed a trucker, smiling proudly next to their rig. Jack's stomach dropped when he realized every face had been crossed out with thick black marker. Beneath the photos was a message scrawled in blood-red paint. "The road takes its due." Jack stumbled back, his flashlight trembling in his hand. A cold wind swept through the rest stop, and he heard the unmistakable sound of an engine revving outside. Heart pounding, he ran to the door and peered out. The haunted hauler was there, idling silently in the parking lot. Its headlights were off, but Jack could feel its presence, malevolent and oppressive. He backed away, but his foot struck something, a toolbox that hadn't been there before. Inside was a journal, its leather cover worn and cracked. Jack flipped it open, his hands shaking. The entries were scrawled in hurried handwriting, detailing encounters with the phantom truck. The final entry read, "If you see it, you're already marked. The only way to escape is to confront it, face the truck, or become part of the road forever." One passage described a driver's final moments as the truck enveloped their vehicle in shadow, their screams swallowed by the roar of its engine. Another recounted a chilling encounter where the truck seemed to phase through a solid barrier, as if the laws of physics held no sway over it. Chapter 6. The Final Stand. Jack didn't have time to process the implications. The haunted hauler's engine roared to life, its headlights blazing. It charged toward the rest stop, and Jack barely managed to dive out of the way as it smashed through the front wall, debris flying everywhere. Scrambling to his feet, Jack knew he had no choice. He ran to his own rig and climbed inside, his heart hammering. The phantom truck loomed behind him, and Jack gritted his teeth. "All right, you bastard," he muttered. "Let's finish this." He floored the accelerator, his truck roaring as it sped onto the highway. The haunted hauler gave chase, the two vehicles hurtling down the dark road at breakneck speed. Jack's hands were white-knuckled on the wheel as he dodged and weaved, trying to outmaneuver his pursuer. The journal's words echoed in his mind. "Face the truck." Taking a deep breath, Jack slammed on the brakes. His rig screeched to a halt, and the haunted hauler plowed straight toward him. At the last second, Jack swerved, causing the phantom truck to miss him by inches and skid off the road. There was a deafening crash as the haunted hauler collided with a massive oak tree. Flames erupted from its engine, illuminating the night. Jack stepped out of his truck, watching as the fire consumed the phantom vehicle. The whispers faded, replaced by an eerie silence. The ghostly truck seemed to wail as the flames consumed it, the headlights flickering one final time before they went dark. Jack stood there, chest heaving, until the fire burned itself out, leaving nothing but scorched earth and the faint smell of oil. Epilogue. Jack never spoke of that night again. He left the trucking business, settling down in a quiet town far from Highway 66. But sometimes, late at night, he would wake in a cold sweat, the sound of a growling engine echoing in his ears. And somewhere on Highway 66, beneath the pale light of the moon, two headlights flickered to life once more. Story 2. The Revenant Rig. The stretch of Highway 42 was known to seasoned truckers as the Devil's Mile. Though technically only 23 miles long, the highway had a reputation for being longer than it seemed, a cursed path where time and space seemed to stretch unnaturally. For decades, there were tales of ghost sightings, strange disappearances, and an ominous truck that terrorized anyone daring to cross its path. Ethan Cole was not a superstitious man. A practical trucker with years of experience hauling goods across the country, he'd driven every treacherous road imaginable. But as he approached the turnoff to Highway 42, late one Friday night, He couldn't ignore the unease crawling up his spine. The dispatcher had warned him about taking this route, but Ethan had a deadline, and cutting through would save precious hours. His rig, a dependable Peterbilt named Old Faithful, rumbled as he downshifted and merged onto the empty road. Tall pines loomed on either side, their jagged branches clawing at the starless sky. The CB radio was silent, and Ethan, ever the realist, told himself it was just another delivery. But the road had other plans. The first few miles were uneventful, the rhythmic hum of the tires on the asphalt keeping Ethan company. He turned up the radio to drown out the oppressive silence, but every station was static. "Figures," Ethan muttered, switching it off. His GPS screen flickered, the map distorting before freezing entirely. Great, just great. The CB crackled to life. Ethan's hand shot to the dial. "Breaker 19, anyone out there? Over." Silence. Then, faintly, a voice. "Turn around, while you still can." Ethan's grip tightened on the wheel. "Who is this? Come back." The voice dissolved into static, then vanished entirely. He shook his head, chalking it up to interference. But as the road stretched on, the headlights of his truck began to dim and flicker. The shadows seemed to grow darker, the air heavier. Then he saw it. A pair of blood-red taillights glowing faintly in the distance. Ethan eased up on the gas, keeping his distance. The vehicle ahead was enormous, an 18-wheeler that looked decades older than any truck on the road today. Its frame was rusted, its trailer covered in strange, indecipherable symbols that seemed to shift in the flickering glow of Ethan's headlights. As Ethan closed the gap, he noticed something off about the truck. It moved unnaturally, almost gliding, its wheels barely seeming to touch the asphalt. The license plate was obscured by grime, but one word was etched into the rusted metal above it: Revenant. Without warning, the taillights disappeared. Ethan slammed on the brakes, his rig skidding to a stop. The road was empty. No sign of the truck. His heart pounding, Ethan reached for the CB. "Anyone on Highway 42, come back. I just saw a truck. Something's not right here. Over." Static. Then that same voice. "You've been marked." The blood drained from Ethan's face. Before he could respond, his entire rig shuddered violently. The roar of an engine filled the air, deafeningly loud, as if it were right behind him. In his side mirror, Ethan caught a glimpse of the Revenant rig barreling toward him, its headlights ablaze like twin suns. He floored the accelerator, Old Faithful lurching forward. The Revenant rig followed, impossibly fast for its size, closing the gap with ease. Ethan swerved, narrowly avoiding a collision, but the phantom truck stayed on his tail, its horn blaring like a banshee's wail. Ethan's eyes darted to a sign ahead. "Rest area, 1 mile." Desperate, he veered toward the exit, his tires screeching as he pulled into the gravel lot. The rest area was eerily quiet. A small building with flickering fluorescent lights and a vending machine that looked like it hadn't been stocked in years. He jumped out of his rig, scanning the area. No sign of the Revenant rig. The oppressive silence returned, broken only by the distant chirping of crickets. Inside the rest stop, Ethan found a dusty bulletin board plastered with missing persons posters. His stomach churned as he recognized several of the faces. All truckers, all last seen on Highway 42. Scribbled across the top of the board in red ink were the words, "The road claims its own." "What the hell is this?" he muttered, backing away. The floorboards creaked behind him. Ethan spun around, flashlight trembling in his grip. The room was empty, but then he heard it, the faint growl of an engine growing louder. He bolted outside just as the Revenant rig came into view, its headlights bathing the rest area in an unholy glow. Ethan scrambled back into his truck, fumbling with the ignition. Old Faithful roared to life, but the Revenant rig blocked the exit, idling menacingly. Its grills seemed to twist into a grotesque grin, and for the first time, Ethan felt true fear. The CB crackled again, the voice now clearer, colder. "You can't run forever. Make the pact or be claimed." The voice laughed, a sound that sent chills down his spine. "Leave the road and it will leave you. Refuse and you'll join us, forever." Ethan's mind raced. Could he give up trucking? It was his livelihood, his identity. But the alternative? Before he could decide, the Revenant rig revved its engine and charged. Ethan slammed on the gas, Old Faithful roaring as he dodged the spectral truck. The chase resumed, more intense than before, the two rigs tearing down the highway like predators locked in mortal combat. Chapter 6. The Final Stand. The miles blurred together, the road an endless nightmare. Ethan knew he couldn't outrun the Revenant rig forever. He had to end it. Spotting an upcoming bridge, he formulated a desperate plan. As he approached the span, Ethan slowed just enough to let the Revenant rig close the gap. At the last second he swerved, sending Old Faithful into a controlled skid. The Revenant rig, unable to react in time, plowed straight through the guardrail and plunged into the ravine below. Ethan screeched to a halt, panting as he stared at the wreckage. Flames licked the twisted remains of the phantom truck, and for a moment he thought it was over. But then, through the smoke, the headlights flickered back to life. Ethan left the trucking world that night, abandoning Old Faithful at the nearest town. He settled into a quiet life, haunted by the memories of Highway 42. But the road wasn't done with him. Years later, he received a package, a rusted license plate with one word etched into the metal: Revenant. And somewhere, on a dark and lonely highway, a pair of blood-red taillights burned in the night. The Phantom Freight. For decades, the stories about the Phantom Freight had circulated among truckers, whispered in hushed tones at greasy roadside diners and truck stops. The legend spoke of a cursed truck, a massive semi with a jet-black trailer and glowing red headlights that prowled the highways on moonless nights. Those who encountered it were said to vanish without a trace, swallowed by the darkness. But Sam Iron Mercer, a hardened trucker with 30 years of experience, didn't believe in ghost stories. He had faced blizzards in Montana, blistering heat in Arizona, and every road hazard imaginable. Nothing fazed him. So when a lucrative haul required him to traverse the infamous Black Ridge Highway, a road synonymous with the Phantom Freight legend, Sam didn't hesitate. "It's just a damn road," Sam muttered, firing up his rig. The haul was simple. Deliver a load of auto parts from Denver to a repair depot in a remote Utah town. The route cut directly through Black Ridge, a winding stretch of road bordered by dense forests and sheer cliffs. Sam's truck, a gleaming Kenworth nicknamed Titan, purred as he guided it onto the highway. The first leg of the journey was uneventful. The hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of the CB radio were the only sounds that accompanied him. Around midnight, as Sam neared the midpoint of the highway, his radio came alive. "Breaker 19, anyone out there?" a voice called, crackling with static. Sam picked up the mic. "This is Iron Mercer, go ahead." There was a pause, then a reply. "Get off the road. Turn back now." Sam frowned. "Who is this?" "Doesn't matter. The Phantom Freight, it's real. It's hunting tonight. You've been warned." Before Sam could respond, the signal dissolved into static. He shook his head, chalking it up to a prankster. The truckers' network was full of jokers, always trying to scare the rookies. Sam wasn't so easily spooked, but as he pressed on, the forest seemed to close in around him, the trees casting long skeletal shadows across the road. A chill crept into the cab, despite the heater blasting at full power. And then, in the distance, he saw them. 2 red lights, glowing faintly through the fog. At first, Sam thought it was another truck ahead of him. But as he drew closer, he realized something was off. The red lights weren't tail lights. They were too high, positioned at an unnatural angle. They looked like eyes. Sam felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He accelerated, trying to close the gap and get a better look. But no matter how fast he went, the lights remained the same distance ahead, hovering like a beacon in the mist. "What in the hell?" Sam muttered, gripping the wheel tighter. Then, without warning, the lights vanished. Sam's heart skipped a beat. He glanced in his mirrors, scanning the road for any sign of the other vehicle. Nothing. A deafening roar erupted behind him. Sam's eyes darted to the side mirror, and his blood ran cold. The phantom freight was there, its monstrous frame blotting out the road behind him. The truck was unlike anything Sam had ever seen. Its black paint absorbed the light, and its grille twisted into a grotesque, snarling maw. The headlights, those eerie red orbs, seemed to burn into his soul. Sam floored the accelerator, Titan's engine roaring as it surged forward. The phantom freight followed, its horn blaring a deep, guttural sound that shook the very air. No matter how fast he went, it stayed on his tail, matching his every move. Desperate, Sam spotted a sign for a rest stop and swerved toward it, his tires screeching on the asphalt. He pulled into the empty lot and killed the engine, hoping to lose the phantom freight. For a moment, there was silence. No roaring engine, no blaring horn. Sam exhaled shakily and stepped out of the cab. The rest stop was eerily quiet, the flickering neon sign above the vending machines casting a sickly glow. He approached the building, hoping to find another driver or a payphone. Inside, the air was stale, heavy with the scent of mildew. The walls were covered in faded posters, but one caught Sam's eye. It was a missing persons notice, a collage of truckers who had vanished on Black Ridge Highway. Sam's stomach churned when he realized one of the faces looked disturbingly familiar. It was Dale Hendricks, an old friend he hadn't seen in years. "What the—" Sam whispered. The air suddenly grew cold. A low rumble filled the room, and the lights flickered violently. Sam bolted outside just as the phantom freight appeared at the entrance of the lot, its headlights bathing him in crimson light. Chapter 5. The Reckoning. Sam dove back into Titan and fired up the engine. The phantom freight roared in response, its massive form barreling toward him. Sam swerved onto the highway, the chase resuming with renewed intensity. As the miles flew by, Sam noticed the world around him changing. The trees twisted into unnatural shapes, their branches reaching out like claws. The asphalt beneath his wheels cracked and splintered, glowing faintly with an otherworldly light. The phantom freight was toying with him, edging closer before falling back, its horn blaring intermittently. Sam's hands were slick with sweat, his heart pounding like a jackhammer. "What do you want?" he shouted into the void. The CB crackled to life. A voice, deep and hollow, replied, "The road claims all who defy it. Your debt is due." "Debt?" Sam yelled. "I don't owe anything." The voice laughed, a sound that chilled Sam to the core. "You've driven these roads for years, taking without giving back. The highway always collects." Chapter 6. The Sacrifice. Sam knew he couldn't outrun the phantom freight forever. Spotting a narrow canyon road ahead, he devised a desperate plan. He veered off the highway, the phantom freight following closely. The canyon walls closed in around them, the road growing narrower with each turn. Sam pushed Titan to its limits, the engine screaming in protest. As he approached a sharp bend, he slammed on the brakes and yanked the wheel, sending Titan skidding sideways. The Phantom freight, unable to stop in time, plowed straight ahead, its massive frame smashing through the guardrail and into the abyss below. Sam sat in stunned silence, his chest heaving. The distant sound of the Phantom freight's roar faded into nothingness. He had won, or so he thought. Sam completed his delivery and vowed never to take Black Ridge Highway again. But the experience left its mark. At night, he was plagued by nightmares of the Phantom freight, its red headlights burning into his mind. Months later, Sam received a package at his home. Inside was a single item, a black license plate with crimson lettering that read DUE. Somewhere, on a desolate stretch of road, the Phantom freight's engine growled to life once more. The Eternal Convoy. Chapter 1. A Deal with the Road. The town of Ridgewood had always been a place of whispers. Perched on the edge of a sprawling desert, its lifeline was the long and lonely Route 117, a highway shrouded in stories of curses and disappearances. Truckers passing through spoke of the Eternal Convoy, a caravan of spectral trucks doomed to wander the road for eternity, claiming anyone who crossed their path. It was said the convoy appeared to those who had a debt to pay, their engines roaring like the growls of ancient beasts. Bobby Riggs Wilson had heard the stories all his life, but as the owner of his own small trucking company, he had little patience for folklore. Business was drying up, and he'd taken a risky deal to deliver mysterious cargo from Ridgewood to a distribution center 4 states away. The payout was too good to pass up. Just cargo, Bobby muttered as he loaded the crates into his battered Mack truck. Nothing but cargo. But the crates were unmarked, and the man who hired him refused to answer questions. The deal came with a warning. Don't stop, no matter what. Chapter 2. The First Sign Route. 117 was as desolate as ever. The desert stretched endlessly on either side, broken only by the occasional cluster of cacti. Bobby's truck hummed steadily as he settled into the drive, his eyes scanning the horizon. The first sign of trouble came just after dusk. The sky turned a deep, bruised purple, and the air seemed to thicken. Bobby noticed the headlights in his rearview mirror. 2 points of light, distant but steady. At first, he thought it was another trucker, but the lights didn't grow closer. They simply hovered in the distance, keeping pace. Weird, Bobby muttered, tapping the CB radio. Breaker 19, anyone else on 117 tonight? Come back. Silence. Then, a crackling voice replied, Get off the road, they're coming for you. What? Bobby asked, gripping the mic. Who's coming? Static swallowed the reply, and Bobby's grip on the wheel tightened. The headlights behind him began to multiply. 2 became 4, then 6, then a dozen, all lined up in a perfect row. They weren't approaching, they were assembling. By midnight, the convoy was undeniable. The ghostly trucks were visible in the side mirrors, their outlines shimmering like mirages in the desert heat. Their engines growled low, a sound that vibrated through Bobby's bones. He pressed the accelerator, but no matter how fast he drove, the convoy matched his speed. Then came the horn, a deep, resonant blast that echoed across the desert, more felt than heard. Bobby's truck shuddered, and his cargo shifted violently in the trailer. The horn sounded again, this time closer. Lights began to flicker on the dashboard. The CB radio crackled back to life, but it wasn't a voice that came through. It was a chant, low and guttural, in a language Bobby didn't recognize. This can't be real, Bobby whispered, beads of sweat dripping down his face. He gripped the wheel tightly, refusing to look in the mirrors. But out of the corner of his eye, he saw something impossible. One of the spectral trucks had pulled up beside him. Its driver's face was obscured, but the outline of a figure was visible, skeletal hands gripping the wheel. Chapter 4. The Cargo. Desperate to escape, Bobby veered onto a narrow side road, his tires kicking up a storm of dust. The convoy hesitated, their lights dimming for a moment before they followed, engines roaring like predators scenting blood. As Bobby's truck careened through the darkness, the crates in the trailer began to hum. A faint blue glow seeped through the gaps in the wood, and the temperature in the cab plummeted. Bobby reached for the CB mic, his voice trembling. "What's in the cargo?" he shouted into the void. The reply came swiftly, a cold, emotionless voice. "Your burden." The glow intensified, and the truck's electrical systems began to fail. The headlights flickered, the dashboard lights dimmed, and the engine stuttered. Bobby slammed his fist against the wheel, cursing. "Come on, come on!" he yelled. But the spectral convoy was closing in. The lead truck, larger and more menacing than the rest, pulled alongside Bobby, its horn blasting so loudly that his ears rang. He glanced over and saw the driver's face for the first time. It was his own. The road narrowed, forcing Bobby to slow down. The lead truck edged closer, and Bobby felt an unnatural pull, as if his truck was being drawn toward the spectral vehicle. The chanting from the radio grew louder, overlapping voices that filled the cab. Bobby knew he couldn't outrun them. His eyes darted to the glowing crates in the trailer. Whatever was inside, it was the key to ending this nightmare. He swerved off the road, skidding to a stop in a clearing. The convoy encircled him, their lights illuminating the desert like a prison yard. The lead truck idled directly in front of him, its driver's hollow eyes fixed on Bobby. "What do you want from me?" Bobby screamed, stepping out of the cab. The cold air bit at his skin as he approached the trailer. The voice from the CB answered, echoing all around him. The debt must be paid. With shaking hands, Bobby unlocked the trailer. The crate's glow intensified, flooding the desert with an otherworldly light. He pried one open and stumbled back in horror. Inside were artifacts, relics of death, charred bones, ancient coins, and talismans etched with runes. The air grew heavy, and a shadow loomed over him. The lead truck had transformed, its frame twisting into a monstrous skeletal form. Bobby fell to his knees, the chanting growing deafening. He understood now. The cargo wasn't just objects, it was a collection of debts, the price of lives lost on the road, and he was its courier. "What do I do?" he whispered, tears streaming down his face. The shadow of the lead truck loomed closer, and the voice replied, "Pay." Bobby stood, his resolve hardening. He climbed back into his truck and revved the engine. The convoy watched in silence as he accelerated, aiming straight for the lead truck. The impact was explosive, a blinding flash of light that consumed everything. Chapter 7. The Legacy. When Bobby awoke, he was alone in the desert. His truck and the convoy were gone. The only sign of the encounter was a charred patch of earth where the lead truck had stood. In his hand was a single coin, its surface etched with runes that pulsed faintly. He never drove again, but the stories of the eternal convoy persisted. Truckers claimed to see a lone figure walking Route 117, a coin clutched tightly in his hand, always heading toward the horizon. Somewhere, the convoy still roams, waiting for the next soul to carry its burden. Story 5. Whispers in the Attic. The mansion on Blackwood Hill had been abandoned for over 50 years. Locals called it the Hollowmore Estate, though most avoided even speaking its name. It was said to be cursed, a place where people vanished without a trace, where shadows seemed to move on their own, and whispers filled the air when no one was there. For Claire and Mark, it was the perfect challenge. "I'm telling you, there's nothing up there but old furniture and creaky floorboards," Mark said, tossing a flashlight into his backpack. "You'll change your tune once we get inside," Claire teased, grinning. She loved ghost stories and urban legends, and Hollow Moor was the holy grail. "Come on, Mark, think of the stories we can tell after tonight." "Yeah, if we survive," Mark muttered, shaking his head. But he couldn't resist her enthusiasm. Claire had a way of making even the darkest places seem adventurous. By the time they reached the mansion, the sun had set, and the world was bathed in the deep purple of twilight. The estate loomed over them, its spires jagged against the sky like broken teeth. The windows were cracked and covered with grime, and ivy crept up the stone walls, as if trying to strangle the building. Claire's flashlight flickered as she pointed it at the heavy wooden door. "Ready?" Mark sighed. "Let's get this over with." The door groaned as they pushed it open, revealing a grand foyer bathed in shadows. A massive chandelier hung precariously from the ceiling, its crystals coated in dust. The air was thick and musty, carrying the faint scent of rot. Mark clicked on his flashlight and swept it across the room. "See? Just an old house." Claire wasn't convinced. Her flashlight beam caught a staircase that spiraled upward into the darkness. "Let's check upstairs." As they climbed, the floorboards groaned under their weight, and a chill seemed to creep into the air. It was colder than it should have been, given the warm summer night outside. Mark rubbed his arms. "Why is it so cold?" Claire didn't answer. She was focused on a sound, a faint whisper that seemed to echo through the hallway. It was almost imperceptible, like the rustling of leaves, but it sent shivers down her spine. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. Mark froze, his flashlight trembling slightly. "It's just the wind," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. They reached the second floor, where a long hallway stretched before them, lined with doors. Most were closed, but a few were slightly ajar, revealing glimpses of darkness within. Claire moved cautiously, her curiosity outweighing her fear. One door stood out. It was at the end of the hallway, its frame splintered as if someone, or something, had tried to force it open. A faint light flickered from within. Mark grabbed her arm. "We shouldn't go in there." But Claire was already moving forward, drawn by an inexplicable pull. She pushed the door open, revealing a bedroom frozen in time. A 4-poster bed with tattered curtains dominated the room, and a vanity mirror sat in the corner, its surface tarnished and cracked. The whispers grew louder. "Claire, this isn't funny," Mark said, backing away, but she was transfixed by the mirror. As she approached, her flashlight beam caught something in the glass, a shadow that wasn't her own. It moved, shifting closer to her reflection. "Mark, look at this," she said, her voice trembling. Mark reluctantly joined her. In the mirror, they saw themselves, and behind them, a figure. It was tall and emaciated, with hollow eyes and a mouth stretched into a grotesque grin. Its hands were long and skeletal, and they seemed to reach for Claire. She spun around. Nothing was there. "Let's leave," Mark said, panic rising in his voice. "Now!" But Claire was already moving again. "The attic," she whispered. "That's where it's coming from." "What? No, we're leaving." Mark grabbed her arm, but she shook him off. "I just want to see." Against his better judgment, Mark followed her to the pull-down ladder in the hallway. The whispers were louder now, almost rhythmic, like a chant. Claire climbed up first, her flashlight casting strange shadows in the narrow space. Mark hesitated before following. The attic was vast and cluttered, filled with forgotten trunks, broken furniture, and the remnants of lives long gone. The air was thick and heavy, as if the room itself were alive. The whispers seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. In the center of the attic stood a wardrobe. It was out of place, immaculate and gleaming, as though it had been untouched by time. Its polished wood reflected their flashlight beams. "Claire, don't," Mark said as she moved toward it. But Claire couldn't stop. She felt an invisible force pulling her closer, urging her to open the doors. Her fingers trembled as she grasped the handles and pulled. Inside was a mirror, tall and ornate, its silver frame carved with twisted faces and clawed hands. The glass was cloudy, but as Claire peered into it, the shadows within began to take shape. A face appeared, then another, and another. Dozens of hollow-eyed figures pressed against the glass, their mouths moving in silent screams. Suddenly, the glass rippled, and one of the figures lunged forward, its skeletal hand emerging from the mirror. Claire screamed as it grabbed her arm, its grip ice-cold. Mark lunged forward, pulling her free. The mirror cracked, and the attic filled with a deafening roar. The figures pressed harder against the glass, their hollow eyes fixed on Claire. "Run!" Mark shouted. They scrambled down the ladder, the whispers chasing them. As they reached the front door, the mansion seemed to groan, its walls trembling as if alive. The whispers turned into anguished screams, echoing through the halls. They didn't stop running until they were far from the mansion, gasping for breath. When they finally turned back, the house was dark and silent once more. Claire looked down at her arm, where the figure had grabbed her. A dark, hand-shaped bruise was forming, and the skin around it was icy to the touch. The Echoes Beneath Blackthorn Manor. Chapter 1. The Invitation. It was late October when Julia received the invitation to Blackthorn Manor. The letter was sealed with crimson wax, bearing an unfamiliar crest, a gnarled tree with twisted branches. She'd never heard of the sender, a man named Elias Blackthorn, but the letter was strangely compelling. It spoke of a family inheritance tied to her distant lineage, urging her to visit the manor before it passed to someone else. Julia was skeptical. A lone journalist working on her next big feature, she had no interest in long-lost relatives. But the promise of uncovering secrets, possibly even a story worth publishing, was tempting. Against her better judgment, she packed a bag and boarded a train to the remote countryside. The journey was long, the scenery growing more desolate with every passing mile. By the time she arrived at the Blackthorn estate, the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting the manor in shadows. The building was massive, its Gothic spires clawing at the sky. The air smelled of damp earth and decaying leaves. A manservant named Cedric greeted her at the door. He was pale, with sunken eyes that avoided hers. "Welcome to Blackthorn Manor, Miss Julia," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "Mr. Blackthorn awaits you in the study." As Cedric led her through the dimly lit halls, Julia felt a strange heaviness settle over her. The walls were lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors whose eyes seemed to follow her every move. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the faint creak of the wooden floorboards beneath their feet. Elias Blackthorn was waiting in the study, a cavernous room filled with the scent of old books and burning wood. He was an elderly man with a gaunt face, his hands trembling as he gestured for her to sit. "You must be wondering why I've summoned you," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "Our family has a unique legacy, one that you, as the last of our bloodline, must come to understand." "What kind of legacy?" Julia asked, her skepticism tinged with unease. Elias hesitated, his gaze flickering to the shadows that seemed to deepen around them. "There are secrets buried beneath this house, secrets that must never be unearthed, but the Blackthorn bloodline has always borne the burden of guarding them. I am too old to continue this task. It falls to you now." Before Julia could respond, the lights flickered, and the room grew colder. Elias's expression darkened. "They're waking," he whispered. "We don't have much time." Julia was shown to her room, a grand yet eerie space with a canopy bed and a single window overlooking the overgrown gardens. Cedric brought her a tray of food, but refused to answer her questions about Elias's cryptic warning. "You'll understand soon enough," was all he said before retreating. That night, Julia struggled to sleep. The bed was uncomfortable, and the silence was unnerving. At some point she drifted off, only to be woken by a faint sound, a low, rhythmic tapping. She sat up, her heart pounding, and strained to listen. Tap, 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 it seemed to be coming from the walls. Swallowing her fear, Julia grabbed her flashlight and followed the sound. The tapping led her to a hidden door in the corner of her room, its edges barely visible beneath peeling wallpaper. With a shaky hand, she pushed it open. The air beyond the door was cold and damp. A narrow staircase spiraled downward, disappearing into darkness. Julia hesitated, every instinct screaming at her to turn back, but curiosity won out. She descended cautiously, the steps groaning under her weight. At the bottom, she found herself in a stone corridor lined with ancient carvings. The tapping was louder now, echoing off the walls. It led her to a large, iron-bound door. Strange symbols were etched into the metal, and the air around it seemed to hum with energy. As Julia reached for the door, a voice whispered in her ear, "Leave." She spun around, but no one was there. Her flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment she thought she saw a shadow move at the edge of the beam. Heart racing, she fled back up the stairs, slamming the hidden door shut behind her. Chapter 3. The Truth Unveiled. The next morning, Elias was waiting for her in the dining hall. He looked even frailer than the night before, his eyes shadowed with fear. "You found the door, didn't you?" he asked. Julia nodded, her hands trembling around her cup of tea. "What's down there?" Elias sighed, his gaze distant. "A mistake. Long ago, our ancestors delved into things they should have left alone. They sought power, immortality, but they awakened something that cannot be contained." "What is it?" Julia pressed. "We don't know its true nature," Elias admitted. "It feeds on fear, on guilt, on secrets. It whispers lies and truths alike, twisting the minds of those who hear it. The door you found is the last barrier keeping it from escaping." Julia felt a chill crawl down her spine. "Why didn't you warn me?" "I tried," Elias said, "but you had to see it for yourself. Now you understand the gravity of the task that lies before you." Chapter 4. The Descent. That night, the whispers began again, louder and more insistent. They seemed to call Julia's name, beckoning her to return to the hidden door. She fought the urge for hours, but as the clock struck midnight, she found herself standing before it once more. This time, she didn't hesitate. She pushed the door open and descended the staircase, the whispers growing louder with each step. At the bottom, the iron door stood ajar. Beyond it was a vast cavern filled with a pulsating darkness. Shapes moved within it, indistinct and grotesque. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the whispers were deafening, overlapping voices that seemed to come from everywhere at once. In the center of the cavern was an altar, and on it lay a book bound in black leather. Julia approached it cautiously, feeling the oppressive weight of unseen eyes watching her. The book was open, its pages filled with strange symbols and diagrams. As she stared at them, the whispers shifted, forming coherent words. "Free us, or join us. Chapter 5. The Final Choice. Julia backed away from the altar, her mind racing. She wanted to run, to leave the manor and never look back, but the whispers wouldn't let her. They filled her head with visions of Alias's ancestors performing dark rituals, of sacrifices made to keep the entity contained, of the horrors that would be unleashed if the seal was broken. Suddenly, Elias appeared at the top of the stairs, his face pale and lined with desperation. "Don't listen to them," he shouted. "You must destroy the book." Julia hesitated, torn between fear and the whispers' seductive promises. "What happens if I don't?" she asked. Elias's eyes filled with sorrow. "Then you will become one of them." Before she could decide, the darkness surged toward her, tendrils reaching for her. Julia grabbed the book and held it over the altar's flame, the whispers turning into screams of rage and despair. As the book burned, the darkness recoiled, and the cavern began to collapse. Elias dragged Julia up the stairs just as the hidden door slammed shut, cutting off the whispers for good. Epilogue. Julia left Blackthorn Manor the next morning, her mind reeling from the events of the night. Elias stayed behind, determined to ensure the seal remained intact. Though the whispers were gone, Julia knew the darkness would always linger, waiting for another chance to escape. Years later, as she sat in her apartment, writing about the experience, she heard it again. A faint, familiar whisper. The Hollow Ones. Chapter 1. The Letter. In the small coastal town of Greyshore, Sarah Collins was a young historian with a knack for uncovering the past. She spent her days poring over old maps and diaries in the town's archives, content in the quiet solitude of her work. One rainy morning, a peculiar letter arrived at her office. The envelope was yellowed and brittle, the edges worn as though it had been carried through generations. Her name was written in an elegant, looping hand, though she couldn't place who might have sent it. The return address was unfamiliar. Hollow Hill Estate, Windhaven. Inside was a single sheet of parchment with a message that chilled her. Sarah Collins, you are the last of the line. Return to Hollow Hill before the rising moon. We are waiting. No sender, no explanation, just a strange invitation that set her heart racing. Sarah had never heard of Hollow Hill or Windhaven, but the phrasing, the last of the line, struck a nerve. Her parents had died when she was young, and she'd grown up with no knowledge of extended family. The thought of some hidden lineage intrigued her as much as it unsettled her. After a restless night of debating, Sarah decided to investigate. A quick search revealed that Windhaven was a desolate village nestled deep in the moors, abandoned decades ago after a string of unexplained disappearances. The thought of going there alone filled her with dread, but curiosity was a powerful thing. Chapter 2. Arrival at Hollow Hill. The journey to Windhaven was bleak. As Sarah drove her aging sedan through the moors, the landscape grew increasingly barren. Thick fog rolled across the hills, swallowing the road in front of her. By the time she reached the outskirts of Windhaven, the sun had disappeared, leaving her in a world of shadows. Sarah had never heard of Hollow Hill or Windhaven, but the phrasing, the last of the line, struck a nerve. Her parents had died when she was young, and she'd grown up with no knowledge of extended family. The thought of some hidden lineage intrigued her as much as it unsettled her. After a restless night of debating, Sarah decided to investigate. A quick search revealed that Windhaven was a desolate village nestled deep in the moors, abandoned decades ago after a string of unexplained disappearances. The thought of going there alone filled her with dread, but curiosity was a powerful thing. Chapter 2. Arrival at Hollow Hill. The journey to Windhaven was bleak. As Sarah drove her aging sedan through the moors, The landscape grew increasingly barren. Thick fog rolled across the hills, swallowing the road in front of her. By the time she reached the outskirts of Windhaven, the sun had disappeared, leaving her in a world of shadows. The village itself was a ghost town. Empty houses with shattered windows leaned precariously, their roofs sagging. The air was thick with decay, and the only sound was the wind howling through the narrow streets. At the edge of town, she saw it. Hollow Hill Estate. The mansion stood atop a rocky outcrop, its dark silhouette framed by the rising moon. Its windows glowed faintly, though the rest of the structure was shrouded in shadow. As Sarah approached, she felt an inexplicable sense of being watched. Cedric, the old caretaker, greeted her at the door. His face was lined with age, his eyes hollow and sunken. "Miss Collins," he rasped, bowing slightly. "We've been expecting you." "How did you know I'd come?" she asked, her voice trembling. "The estate always calls to its own," he replied cryptically. Inside, the mansion was a maze of twisting hallways and cavernous rooms. Candles flickered in ornate sconces, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The air was damp and heavy, carrying the faint scent of mildew. Cedric led her to the study, where she found a journal lying open on the desk. It belonged to her great-grandfather, Elias Collins, who had lived in Hollow Hill before disappearing under mysterious circumstances. Elias's journal was filled with meticulous entries detailing the estate's history. It spoke of the Collins family's long stewardship of Hollow Hill, a duty passed down through generations, but the further she read, the more disturbing the entries became. March 13th, 1887. The Hollow Ones stir beneath the house. Their whispers grow louder with each passing night, calling for blood. I fear the seal will not hold much longer. April 4th, 1887. They took Martha. She wandered too close to the cellar. Her screams, God, I can still hear them. There was nothing I could do. The Hollow Ones are growing stronger. If you are reading this, it means I have failed. You must not make the same mistake. Do not listen to their voices. Do not open the gate. Sarah's hands trembled as she turned the pages. What were the Hollow Ones? What gate was Elias referring to? Before she could find more answers, Cedric reappeared in the doorway. "It's time," he said. "For what?" Sarah asked. "To meet them." The cellar Cedric led her to a hidden staircase behind a tapestry in the main hall. The steps spiraled downward into darkness, the air growing colder with each step. Sarah's flashlight barely penetrated the gloom, and she felt as though the shadows were closing in around her. At the bottom of the stairs, they reached a heavy iron door covered in strange carvings. Cedric produced an old key and unlocked it. The door groaned open, revealing a cavernous chamber lit by the faint glow of bioluminescent fungi. The room was filled with ancient stone pillars, each etched with runes that pulsed faintly. In the center was a circular pit, surrounded by chains and locks. The pit seemed to breathe, a faint rhythmic rise and fall that made Sarah's stomach churn. "This is the gate," Cedric whispered. "The Hollow Ones are bound here. They hunger for freedom, but the seal has kept them at bay. Until now." "What do you mean, until now?" Sarah asked, backing away. Cedric's expression darkened. "The seal is failing. It requires a sacrifice to restore its power." Cedric explained the horrifying truth. The Collins family had been chosen to guard the Hollow Ones, eldritch entities from another realm. The seal that bound them required blood to remain strong, and Elias had sacrificed himself to maintain it. But over the decades, the seal had weakened. Without a new offering, the Hollow Ones would break free, consuming everything in their path. "No," Sarah said, shaking her head. "There has to be another way." "There isn't," Cedric replied. You were called here for this purpose. It is your blood that will keep them contained." Before she could respond, the ground beneath them trembled. A deafening roar filled the chamber as the pit began to glow, and the chains rattled violently. The hollow ones were awakening. Chapter 6. The Escape. Refusing to accept her fate, Sarah turned and ran. Cedric shouted after her, but his voice was drowned out by the growing cacophony of whispers and guttural growls. She retraced her steps through the dark corridors, the mansion shaking around her. The whispers grew louder, forming words that slithered into her mind. "Stay. Join us. You cannot escape." She burst out of the front door into the cold night, her car barely visible through the fog. As she drove away, she saw the mansion's windows glowing with an unnatural light. The whispers followed her, echoing in her ears even as she put miles between herself and Hollow Hill. Epilogue. Weeks later, Sarah returned to Greyshore, hoping to leave the horrors of Hollow Hill behind. But the whispers never left her. They followed her in her dreams, in the quiet moments of the day, growing louder with each passing night. One evening, she woke to find her reflection in the mirror smiling back at her, though her own face was frozen in terror. The Hollow Ones were patient. They had waited for generations, and now they had found their way into her soul,